Benjamin Crow. Feather froze mid-step on his porch, coffee mug slipping from weathered fingers and shattering against wooden boards. The sound that pierced the pre-dawn Montana silence wasn't the familiar whine of his beloved companion. It was something wild, primal, haunting. Shadow wasn't howling like any dog he'd ever known. Mary Singing Bird's kitchen light flickered on next door, her silhouette appearing at the window with hands pressed against glass. The elderly widow's terrified gasp carried across the 40 feet between their homes, confirming what Benjamin's heart already knew, but his mind refused to accept. 3 years of morning coffee together, 3 years of gentle companionship, 3 years of believing he'd rescued an abandoned German Shepherd mix from that storm-ravaged highway. Now Shadow stood silhouetted against the pale moonlight, head thrown back in an ancient song that spoke of wilderness, pack bonds, and something far more dangerous than suburban pet ownership. Thomas White Eagle's patrol car sirens wailed in the distance, racing toward the source of concerned 911 calls. What exactly had been sleeping by his fireplace all this time? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Benjamin Crow Feather had always believed that loneliness was the cruelest companion of old age, but grief, he'd learned, was far worse. At 72, the retired veterinarian carried the weight of too many goodbyes. His beloved wife Margaret to cancer 2 years prior, his son Michael to an IED in Afghanistan 5 years before that. The modest cabin on the Pine Ridge Reservation border had become both sanctuary and prison, filled with memories that whispered through empty rooms like autumn wind through bare branches. "Lord knows I wasn't looking for another heartbreak," he'd told Pastor Williams after Margaret's funeral, when well-meaning friends suggested adopting a companion animal. Benjamin had spent 40 years healing creatures, and the thought of watching another beloved life slip away felt unbearable. Yet 3 years ago, during the worst thunderstorm Montana had seen in decades, fate delivered something extraordinary to his doorstep. The tiny black pup had been barely alive, soaked and shivering beside Highway 89, likely thrown from a vehicle during the chaos of the storm. Benjamin's veterinary instincts kicked in before his grieving heart could protest. Through that long night, he'd bottle-fed the fragile creature, cleaned infected wounds, and whispered the same prayers he'd offered during Margaret's final days. When those unusual amber eyes finally opened and focused on his weathered face, Benjamin felt something shift inside his chest, the first warmth he'd experienced since placing roses on his wife's grave. Shadow, he'd named him, watching the pup's dark fur catch firelight like living darkness. The name felt right, this creature who'd emerged from the shadows of his deepest sorrow to bring purpose back to days that had stretched endlessly empty. Now Shadow was magnificent, 95 pounds of sleek muscle and intelligence that bordered on supernatural. Unlike any dog Benjamin had known in his decades of practice, Shadow never barked, communicating instead through expressive whines and those haunting amber eyes that seemed to see straight through to a person's soul. He opened doors with deft paws, brought Benjamin his heart medication without prompting, and somehow knew exactly when the old man needed comfort most. The neighbors in Broken Arrow had grown to love Shadow as much as Benjamin did. Mary Singing Bird, the 68-year-old widow next door, credited Shadow with saving her life when he'd refused to leave her porch during her heart attack 6 months ago, his insistent whining eventually drawing Benjamin's attention. "That dog's got more sense than most humans," she'd declared, and the small community of 2,800 had embraced Shadow as their unofficial guardian. But tonight, something had changed. Tonight, Shadow's behavior carried an edge that made Benjamin's veterinarian instincts prickle with unease. The methodical perimeter checks, the rigid alertness, and now this haunting vocalization that spoke of wild places and ancient instincts. Suddenly Benjamin wondered if he'd been living with something far more complex than the loyal companion who'd healed his broken heart. David Thundercloud had been photographing Montana wildlife for 15 years, but he'd never captured anything quite like the footage his trail camera recorded that Tuesday morning. The motion-activated device positioned near Willow Creek to document elk migration patterns had instead recorded something that made his hands tremble as he reviewed the digital files on his laptop screen. The creature moved through the frame with fluid grace, pausing to drink from the stream before lifting its head in perfect profile. The amber eyes caught the infrared light like twin flames, and the proportions were unmistakable. Elongated snout, large pointed ears, and a body built for endurance rather than the compact musculature of domestic breeds. Most telling were the massive paws, nearly twice the size of any dog's, designed for traversing wilderness terrain. "Sweet Jesus," David whispered, zooming in on the timestamp. The footage was taken just half a mile from Benjamin Crow Feather's property at 4:23 a.m., less than an hour after the mysterious howling had woken half the town. But what made David's blood run cold was the collar clearly visible around the creature's neck, the same red leather collar he'd seen on Benjamin's beloved companion countless times at the general store. Within hours, David's social media post had exploded across wildlife forums and local news feeds. "Wolf living as pet in Broken Arrow, Montana," the headline screamed, accompanied by the crystal-clear footage that left no room for interpretation. The post garnered 3,000 shares in the first hour, drawing attention from wildlife officials, journalists, and concerned citizens far beyond their small community. Dr. Sarah Moon Walker received the panicked phone call from Benjamin at noon, her veterinary clinic suddenly buzzing with reporters and curious townspeople. "Doc, you've got to tell them they're wrong," Benjamin pleaded, his voice cracking with desperation. "Shadow's family. He's been with me 3 years. There's got to be some mistake." Sarah had always suspected something unusual about Shadow during his rare visits to her clinic. The creature's vital signs, bone structure, and behavior patterns had raised questions she diplomatically avoided asking. Now, faced with incontrovertible photographic evidence, she couldn't spare her old friend's feelings any longer. "Benjamin, I need to be honest with you," she said gently, guiding him into her private office while Shadow waited calmly in the examination room. "I've suspected for some time that Shadow might not be entirely domestic. His skull measurements, tooth alignment, and instinctive behaviors, they're all consistent with wolf characteristics. The DNA test we ran last year for his health screening confirmed it. I just didn't have the heart to tell you." The revelation hit Benjamin like a physical blow. 3 years of love, companionship, and healing, had it all been built on a lie? He thought of Shadow's unusual intelligence, the way he'd never quite behaved like other dogs, his uncanny ability to sense emotions and respond with perfect timing, signs he'd chosen to ignore in favor of the comfort Shadow provided during his darkest hours. Meanwhile, the community reaction was swift and polarizing. Grace Morningstar, the pragmatic town council member, called an emergency meeting for that evening. "We're talking about an apex predator living among our children," she declared to the hastily assembled crowd at the community center. "This isn't some Disney movie. Wolves are dangerous, unpredictable animals that belong in the wilderness, not in our backyards." But Mary Singing Bird stood up from her seat in the back row, her weathered hands shaking with emotion. "That's not the Shadow I know," she said firmly. "6 months ago, when I had my heart attack, he saved my life. Sat on my porch, whining and scratching until Benjamin came over and found me. No dangerous predator would have done that." Rachel Dawn Light, the young teacher at Broken Arrow Elementary, added her voice to the growing debate. "Last spring, when my class was on a nature walk, Shadow appeared out of nowhere and positioned himself between us and an aggressive black bear. He didn't attack, he just stood there, calm as you please, until the bear moved on. My students adore him. He's never shown an ounce of aggression toward any child." The financial reality struck Benjamin like cold water. His modest veterinarian pension barely covered his increasing medical expenses, and Shadow's specialized diet, organic meat, and supplements to maintain his health cost nearly $300 monthly. His homeowner's insurance had already threatened cancellation once they learned about his large dog, and if they discovered Shadow's true nature, Benjamin could lose everything. As night fell over Broken Arrow, Benjamin sat on his porch with Shadow curled at his feet, watching news vans arrive and reporters set up cameras across the street. The creature who'd brought him back from the brink of despair now represented the center of a storm that threatened to tear their small community apart. Shadow's amber eyes reflected the porch light as he gazed up at Benjamin with the same trusting expression that had melted the old man's heart 3 years ago. The question that haunted Benjamin through the sleepless night wasn't whether Shadow was a wolf. The evidence was overwhelming. The question was whether love could survive the truth. The black government SUVs arrived at dawn on Thursday, their tinted windows reflecting the morning sun like dead eyes as they formed a perimeter around Benjamin's property. Joseph Running Bear stepped out of the lead vehicle with the measured authority of a man accustomed to delivering unwelcome news. At 45, the federal Fish and Wildlife agent carried himself with military precision, his weathered face set in lines that suggested he'd seen too much of humanity's capacity for both cruelty and foolishness. Behind him emerged a team of specialists, wildlife officers, legal advisors, and a veterinary technician equipped with tranquilizer equipment. The message was clear. This wasn't a negotiation. It was an intervention. "Mr. Crow Feather," Joseph announced, his voice carrying across the yard as Benjamin emerged from his cabin with Shadow at his side. "I'm Agent Joseph Running Bear with the United States Fish and Wildlife Service. I believe you know why I'm here." Benjamin's hands trembled as he placed one protectively on Shadow's broad head. The wolf, he could no longer deny what Shadow truly was, remained calm despite the obvious threat, his amber eyes alert but showing no aggression toward the assembled officials. "He's not hurting anyone," Benjamin said, his voice barely above a whisper. 3 years he's been part of this community. 3 years of helping people, protecting them. Doesn't that count for something?" Joseph's expression remained stone cold, but something flickered behind his dark eyes, a pain so deep it had crystallized into inflexible purpose. "Mr. Crowfeather, you're harboring an apex predator without permits, in violation of the Endangered Species Act and multiple federal regulations. But more importantly, you're endangering innocent lives. I'm giving you 72 hours to surrender the animal voluntarily, or we'll be forced to take more drastic measures." The agent's words carried a weight that made Benjamin's chest tighten with recognition. This wasn't just about legal compliance. There was something personal driving Joseph Running Bear's determination, something that went beyond bureaucratic duty. Sheriff Thomas White Eagle arrived as the federal agents were departing, his weathered pickup truck a stark contrast to their official vehicles. Thomas had known Benjamin for 20 years, had watched him grieve Margaret's death and slowly rebuild his life around Shadow's companionship. The sight of his old friend's distress ignited a protective anger in the sheriff's chest. "They can't just take him," Thomas declared, though his voice lacked conviction. Federal jurisdiction trumped local authority, and they both knew it. "There's got to be something we can do, tribal sovereignty, appeals process, something." Benjamin's response was cut short by Shadow's sudden alertness. The wolf's head snapped toward the tree line, ears rigid as rifle barrels, and a low growl rumbled from his throat. It was the first sign of aggression Benjamin had ever witnessed from his companion, and it sent ice through his veins. Joseph Running Bear hadn't left. He stood at the edge of the property, partially concealed behind a cluster of pine trees, watching. When Shadow's growl intensified, Joseph stepped into the open, his hand resting on a holstered tranquilizer gun. The recognition between predator and hunter was instant and mutual. "You know him," Benjamin whispered, the realization hitting like a physical blow. "Shadow knows you." The wolf's body language had shifted completely. No longer the gentle companion who brought Benjamin his morning slippers, but something wild and wary, every muscle coiled for action. Shadow positioned himself between Benjamin and Joseph, a protective stance that spoke of deep instincts awakened by the scent of an old enemy. Word of the federal ultimatum spread through Broken Arrow like wildfire, dividing the small community along lines that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with the heart. Mary Singing Bird organized the Save Shadow faction from her kitchen table, rallying the elderly residents who'd experienced the wolf's gentle protection firsthand. "I've lived 78 years on this earth," she declared to anyone who'd listen. "And I know the difference between good and evil. That wolf has more goodness in his heart than half the humans I've met. They want to take him away from Benjamin? Over my dead body." But Grace Morningstar represented equally valid concerns from the town's younger families. Standing before the emergency town council meeting that Thursday evening, she held up enlarged photographs of wolf attack victims from other regions. "I'm not questioning Shadow's past behavior," she said, her voice steady despite the emotional charge in the room. "But we're talking about a wild animal living among our children. What happens when his instincts override his training? What happens when he decides our kids look like prey?" The meeting erupted into shouting matches that revealed deeper fractures in the community. Ranchers who'd lost livestock to wolf packs supported immediate removal. Parents of young children demanded guarantees no one could provide. The elderly, many living alone and isolated, saw Shadow as a symbol of protection in a world that increasingly forgot about their needs. Benjamin sat in the back row, Shadow calm at his feet despite the chaos swirling around them. The wolf's behavior was remarkable. Surrounded by raised voices and hostile energy, he remained peaceful, occasionally placing his massive head on Benjamin's knee in a gesture of comfort that broke the old man's heart. Dr. Sarah Moon Walker took the microphone with reluctance, knowing her words would carry special weight as the town's veterinarian. "I've examined Shadow multiple times over 3 years," she admitted. "His behavior patterns are unlike any wolf I've studied in my professional training. He shows signs of socialization that typically only occur in domestic animals, but I can't guarantee future behavior based on past performance. Wolves are complex creatures with instincts we don't fully understand." The legal complications were staggering. Benjamin's property straddled the border between state and reservation land, creating jurisdictional nightmares that lawyers would spend months untangling. The tribal council held emergency sessions, debating whether Shadow fell under their sovereignty or federal authority. Traditional elders spoke of wolves as sacred beings, spirit guides who deserved respect rather than fear. As the 72-hour deadline approached, Benjamin faced impossible choices. He could surrender Shadow voluntarily, hoping for humane treatment through official channels. He could resist, potentially facing federal charges and losing everything he'd worked for in his retirement. Or he could run, taking Shadow into the wilderness where they might find freedom, but would certainly find hardship. The sleepless nights took their toll on Benjamin's aging body. His hands shook more frequently, his memory seemed cloudier, and twice he found himself standing in his kitchen with no recollection of why he'd entered the room. Shadow noticed every change, staying closer to Benjamin's side, guiding him gently when confusion struck. On Saturday morning, with less than 24 hours remaining before the deadline, Joseph Running Bear returned alone. This time, he came not as a federal agent, but as a man carrying 3 years of grief that had crystallized into obsession. "I need to tell you something," he said. his official composure cracking for the first time. 3 years ago, wolves killed my 8-year-old daughter. The words hung between them like smoke from a dying fire, heavy with pain that had been festering for 3 long years. Joseph Running Bear's composure crumbled as he spoke of Emma Stone Crow, his daughter whose laughter had filled their home until that terrible day at Yellowstone National Park. Benjamin watched the federal agent transform before his eyes, no longer the cold bureaucrat, but a broken father whose grief had hardened into something that resembled justice, but felt like vengeance. She was feeding chipmunks, Joseph continued, his voice cracking like thin ice. Emma loved animals more than anything in this world. Wanted to be a veterinarian like you, actually. The campground rangers had assured us the area was safe, that the wolf pack had moved on. But they were wrong. His hands clenched into fists, knuckles white with the force of memory. They found pieces of her clothing, blood. Nothing else. Shadow remained perfectly still during Joseph's confession, but Benjamin could feel the wolf's tension through their physical contact. Something about Joseph's story resonated in ways that went beyond mere coincidence. Shadow's reaction suggested recognition, memory, perhaps even guilt. I've spent every day since then tracking wolf movements, studying pack behavior, documenting every attack on humans in the Northwest region, Joseph said. Do you know how many families have suffered because people like you think wild animals make good pets? 17 documented cases in the past 5 years. 17 families destroyed because someone thought they could tame the untamable. Dr. Sarah Moon Walker arrived that afternoon with test results that complicated everything. Her hands trembled as she spread the laboratory reports across Benjamin's kitchen table, Shadow watching from his position by the fireplace with those eerily intelligent amber eyes. The DNA analysis is more complex than I initially thought, she admitted, adjusting her reading glasses. Shadow isn't pure wolf, Benjamin. He's a hybrid, roughly 75% gray wolf, 25% German shepherd. That explains his unusual socialization patterns and his ability to adapt to domestic life. The revelation should have been reassuring, but instead it raised more questions than it answered. How had a wolf-dog hybrid ended up abandoned on a Montana highway? Why had Shadow's canine genetics made him more adaptable to human companionship while retaining the physical characteristics and some instincts of his wild heritage? Meanwhile, the media circus surrounding Shadow's story had attracted national attention. CNN, Fox News, and National Geographic had all dispatched crews to Broken Arrow, transforming the quiet reservation border town into a battleground for America's complex relationship with wilderness conservation. Animal rights activists camped outside Benjamin's property with signs reading "Save Shadow" and "Love has no species," while counter-protesters held banners declaring "Children's safety first" and "Wild animals belong in the wild." The economic pressure on Benjamin intensified daily. His modest savings, already strained by Margaret's medical bills and his own increasing healthcare costs, couldn't withstand the financial onslaught. The specialized diet Shadow required as a large carnivore cost nearly $400 monthly. His homeowner's insurance had been canceled the moment the company learned about Shadow's true nature, leaving Benjamin liable for any potential damages or injuries. Mary Singing Bird, bless her heart, had organized a fundraising campaign that raised $3,000 from community members and online supporters. But Benjamin knew it was a temporary bandage on a hemorrhaging wound. If he kept Shadow, he'd lose his home within 6 months. If he surrendered Shadow, he'd lose the only family he had left. The nights were the worst. Benjamin would lie awake listening to Shadow's breathing, remembering Margaret's final weeks when each night might have been their last together. The parallel was almost too painful to bear. Once again, he was watching something he loved slip away, powerless to prevent the inevitable loss. Shadow seemed to sense Benjamin's distress, spending more time pressed against the old man's side, bringing his slippers without being asked, even attempting to comfort Benjamin during the episodes where grief overwhelmed him completely. The wolf's emotional intelligence was remarkable, almost supernatural in its precision. On Tuesday morning, David Thundercloud arrived with devastating news. His wildlife cameras had captured footage of other wolves in the area, a small pack moving through the forest corridors that connected Broken Arrow to the broader wilderness. The implications were staggering. "Shadow's been communicating with them," David explained, showing Benjamin the trail camera footage on his laptop. "Look at this. 3 other wolves, all larger than typical for this region. They've been staying just outside the town boundaries, but they're definitely responding to Shadow's vocalizations." The footage showed Shadow at the edge of town, standing at the tree line in what appeared to be purposeful communication with his wild cousins. His posture was different in these recordings, more alert, more primitive, carrying himself with the confidence of a pack leader rather than a domestic companion. "They're waiting for him," David continued. "Maybe they always have been. Shadow might not be lost from civilization. He might be choosing it for now." Joseph Running Bear used this new evidence to strengthen his case for immediate removal. "The situation is escalating," he announced at another emergency town meeting. "We're no longer talking about one domesticated wolf. We're talking about a pack establishing territory around a human settlement. This is exactly how attacks begin." Grace Morningstar seized on the new information to rally support for Shadow's removal. "Look at what we're dealing with," she declared, projecting David's wolf pack footage for the packed community center. "Shadow isn't just a pet anymore, he's become a bridge between our town and wild predators. How long before those other wolves decide our livestock, our pets, even our children look appetizing?" But Thomas White Eagle stood up from the sheriff's section, his weathered face reflecting years of experience with both human and animal behavior. "I've been law enforcement in this county for 22 years, he said, his voice carrying the authority of lived experience. "In all that time, Shadow has never shown aggression toward a human being. Not once." "If he was dangerous, wouldn't we have seen evidence by now?" Rachel Dawn Light added her voice to the debate, standing up from the teacher's section with tears in her eyes. "Shadow saved my students from a black bear last spring. He didn't attack the bear. He didn't show aggression. He just positioned himself between danger and children exactly like any protective dog would do. That's not predator behavior, that's guardian behavior." The community remained split, but the pressure was building toward an inevitable resolution. Parents kept their children indoors after school. Ranchers armed themselves when checking livestock. The elderly residents, many of whom had grown to depend on Shadow's protective presence, felt increasingly isolated and vulnerable. Benjamin's health began deteriorating under the stress. His blood pressure spiked, requiring medication adjustments that left him dizzy and confused. Twice that week, Mary Singing Bird found him standing in his yard in his pajamas, looking lost and frightened. Shadow had been beside him both times, gently guiding Benjamin back toward the house with the patience of a trained therapy animal. Dr. Moonwalker privately expressed concern about Benjamin's cognitive state. "The stress is exacerbating what might be early dementia symptoms," she told Mary during a hushed conversation at the general store. "He's not processing information clearly anymore. Sometimes he doesn't seem to recognize Shadow's true nature. Talks about him like he's still just a German Shepherd mix." The final straw came when federal authorities discovered that Shadow's hybrid status made the legal situation even more complicated. Wolf-dog hybrids existed in a regulatory gray area, subject to different laws depending on their percentage of wild genetics and their documented behavior patterns. Some states banned them entirely, while others allowed ownership with special permits. Montana's regulations were ambiguous enough to create legal battles that could drag on for years. Thursday evening brought unexpected visitors to Benjamin's cabin. A caravan of cars pulled into his driveway, disgorging a group of people he hadn't seen in months. Fellow veterans, members of his late wife's church group, retired colleagues from his veterinary practice. They came bearing casseroles, coffee, and unwavering support. "Benjamin Crow Feather," announced Martha Running Elk, his wife's former prayer circle leader. "We've known you for 40 years. If you say this wolf is family, then he's our family too. Federal government or no federal government, we stand with you." The impromptu support gathering filled Benjamin's small cabin with warmth and laughter for the first time since the crisis began. Shadow moved among the visitors with his characteristic grace, accepting pets and gentle words from people who'd known him since puppyhood. His behavior was impeccable, calm, friendly, showing no signs of the dangerous predator federal agents claimed him to be. But as the evening progressed and visitors began departing, the harsh reality reasserted itself. Joseph Running Bear's 72-hour deadline would expire at midnight Friday. Unless Benjamin surrendered Shadow voluntarily, federal agents would return with tranquilizer guns and transport equipment. That night, as Benjamin sat by the fireplace with Shadow curled at his feet, he made the most difficult decision of his 72 years. He couldn't bear the thought of watching federal agents drag away the creature who'd brought light back into his darkest hours. If Shadow had to leave, it would be on their own terms, with dignity intact and love unbroken. "Come on, boy," Benjamin whispered, reaching for his coat. "Let's go for one last walk in our mountains." The emergency town hall meeting on Friday evening erupted into chaos before Sheriff Thomas White Eagle could even call it to order. 300 residents packed into the community center, spilling out into the hallways and parking lot, while news crews positioned cameras to capture what everyone knew would be the final decision on Shadow's fate. The air crackled with tension as neighbors who'd known each other for decades found themselves on opposite sides of an issue that had torn their small community apart. Grace Morningstar took the podium first, her voice steady despite the emotional charge in the room. "I've lived in Broken Arrow my entire life," she began, "and I've never seen anything divide us like this. But we have to face facts. We're harboring a wild predator in our community, and every day we delay action, we risk tragedy." She gestured toward the packed crowd of families with young children. "How do we explain to a parent that we chose sentiment over safety? How do we live with ourselves if someone gets hurt?" The crowd rumbled with mixed reactions, some nodding in agreement while others shook their heads in disgust. Mary Singing Bird struggled to her feet from the front row, her weathered hands gripping her walking cane as she faced down the woman she'd once called friend. "Grace Morningstar, shame on you," Mary declared, her voice carrying the authority of her 78 years. "That wolf saved my life when my heart gave out. He sits with lonely old folks when their families forget to visit. He's gentler with children than most humans I know. You want to destroy something beautiful because you're afraid of what might happen instead of grateful for what has happened." The battle lines were clearly drawn. Ranchers and young families populated one side of the room, while elderly residents and longtime friends of Benjamin clustered on the other. The division wasn't clean. Some parents spoke passionately about Shadow's gentleness with their children, while some seniors worried about the precedent of harboring wild animals. Dr. Sarah Moon Walker presented the scientific evidence with clinical detachment, though her voice wavered slightly as she described Shadow's hybrid nature. "Wolf-dog hybrids represent a unique category," she explained, projecting charts and genetic analysis onto the wall. "They retain some wild instincts while possessing enhanced socialization capabilities. Shadow's behavior over 3 years suggests successful integration, but I cannot guarantee future predictability." Joseph Running Bear sat in the back row, his federal authority giving him the power to end the debate with a single phone call. But something had changed in his demeanor since his emotional confession to Benjamin. The cold, bureaucratic mask had slipped, revealing a man wrestling with his own demons as much as with policy enforcement. Rachel Dawn Light stood to address the crowd, her young voice carrying unexpected authority as she spoke from the teachers' section. Last spring, Shadow appeared during our nature walk and positioned himself between my third-grade class and an aggressive black bear. He didn't attack, didn't show aggression, he just stood there, calm and protective until the danger passed. Those children went home safe because of Shadow. How is that the behavior of a dangerous predator? The emotional testimony continued for hours. Elderly residents described how Shadow checked on them during storms, how he'd alerted neighbors to medical emergencies, how his presence had made them feel less vulnerable in their isolated homes. Parents shared stories of their children's gentle interactions with the massive creature they'd believed was simply a large dog. Thomas White Eagle finally called for order as the debate threatened to devolve into shouting matches. "Folks, we need to make a decision tonight," he announced. "Federal agents will be here in the morning with or without our blessing. The question before us is simple. Do we stand behind Benjamin Crowfeather and Shadow, or do we step aside and let nature take its course?" The vote was scheduled for 9 o'clock, giving community members time to wrestle with their consciences and the weight of their decision. But as 8:30 approached, Benjamin still hadn't arrived. Mary Singing Bird had called his house repeatedly, receiving no answer. Thomas dispatched a deputy to check on the old man, fearing the stress might have triggered a medical emergency. Deputy Martinez returned with alarming news. Benjamin's cabin was empty, Shadow's food and water bowls untouched since morning. His truck was gone, and neighbors reported hearing it leave before dawn. A hastily scrawled note on the kitchen table read simply, "Gone to give Shadow a chance to choose his own life. Don't look for us." The revelation sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd. Benjamin had taken Shadow into the wilderness, either to set him free among his own kind or to disappear together rather than face separation. The romantic gesture struck some as noble, others as dangerously irresponsible. Joseph Running Bear's reaction was swift and decisive. "This changes everything," he announced, taking control of the meeting. "We're no longer dealing with a compliance issue. We have a missing elderly man and a dangerous animal loose in the wilderness during hunting season. I'm implementing emergency search protocols immediately." Within an hour, the community center had transformed into a search and rescue command post. Federal agents coordinated with local volunteers, park rangers, and tribal police to organize grid searches of the vast wilderness surrounding Broken Arrow. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The same community that had been divided over Shadow's fate was now united in desperate concern for both the wolf and the man who loved him. David Thundercloud volunteered his wildlife tracking expertise, reading sign and following trails with skills learned from his grandfather. The tracks were easy to follow initially. Benjamin's truck had taken the old logging road that wound deep into the national forest. But where the road ended, the trail became more complex. "They're not moving randomly," David reported over radio to the command post. "Shadow's leading, Benjamin's following. The wolf knows where he's going." The tracks showed a purposeful journey deeper into wilderness areas where few humans ventured, terrain that would challenge even experienced hikers. Search teams worked through the night, their flashlights creating dancing shadows among the pine trees as they called Benjamin's name and listened for Shadow's distinctive howl. The temperature was dropping, and everyone knew that an elderly man spending a night outdoors in Montana mountains faced serious hypothermia risk. Mary Singing Bird refused to leave the command post, making coffee for exhausted searchers and fielding calls from concerned residents. Her face was etched with worry, but she maintained the stoic strength that had carried her through 7 decades of ranch life. "Benjamin's tougher than he looks," she told anyone who'd listen, "and Shadow won't let anything happen to him." The search took a dramatic turn when helicopter spotters reported seeing a campfire approximately 15 miles from the last vehicle sighting, in a remote canyon that required technical climbing skills to access. The location was significant. It bordered the territory where David's trail cameras had documented the wild wolf pack Shadow had been communicating with. "They're not just hiding," Thomas White Eagle realized as he studied topographical maps. "They're heading toward the other wolves. Shadow's taking Benjamin to meet his family." Joseph Running Bear's face went pale as he processed the implications. A 72-year-old man alone with multiple wolves in remote wilderness, he said, his voice tight with professional alarm. "This is how tragedies happen. We need to move fast." The technical rescue team included rock climbing specialists, wilderness medics, and Joseph himself, despite the emotional trauma the situation was triggering. As they rappelled into the canyon by moonlight, following the glow of Benjamin's campfire, everyone understood they might be witnessing the final chapter of an extraordinary love story, either a reunion between man and nature or a tragedy that would haunt the community forever. The campfire flickered in the distance like a beacon of hope, but what they would find there would challenge everything they thought they knew about the bonds between humans and wild animals and force them to confront the true meaning of family, loyalty, and sacrifice in ways none of them had anticipated. The rescue team found Benjamin Crow Feather sitting by his dying campfire at dawn, his weathered face illuminated by the last flickering flames as tears streamed down his cheeks unchecked. Shadow lay motionless beside him, the wolf's magnificent black coat matted with blood from what appeared to be a devastating fall down the rocky canyon wall. Benjamin's hands trembled as he stroked Shadow's still form, whispering words of comfort that came 3 hours too late. "I killed him," Benjamin said without looking up as the searchers approached, his voice hollow with a grief that seemed to age him another decade in the span of a sentence. "My boy came all this way to show me his real family, and I killed him with my foolishness." Joseph Running Bear knelt beside the old man and the fallen wolf, his trained eyes assessing the scene while his heart wrestled with unexpected emotion. Shadow's injuries were severe, multiple fractures, internal bleeding, the kind of trauma that came from a 50-foot fall onto unforgiving stone. But what struck Joseph most powerfully was the positioning of Benjamin's small camp, clearly arranged so the dying wolf could see both his human father and the pack of wild wolves watching from the opposite canyon wall. "Tell me what happened," Joseph said gently, his federal authority forgotten in the face of raw human suffering. Benjamin's story emerged in fractured pieces, interrupted by sobs that shook his frail shoulders. They had hiked for hours following Shadow's lead, the wolf moving with purpose toward something Benjamin couldn't understand. When they reached this remote canyon, Shadow had begun vocalizing, not his usual quiet whines, but full-throated howls that echoed off the rock walls and received answers from the darkness above. "He was calling to them," Benjamin whispered, gesturing toward the ridge where 3 large shapes remained visible in the growing daylight. "His real family. They came down to meet us, and Shadow was so happy, so excited. He was running back and forth between me and them, trying to bridge 2 worlds that were never meant to touch." The tragedy had unfolded with heartbreaking inevitability. As Shadow bounded between Benjamin and the wild wolves, demonstrating his love for both families, the unstable canyon ledge had given way beneath his massive weight. The wolf had tumbled into the rocky chasm while trying to show his human father that love could exist in many forms simultaneously. "He chose me," Benjamin said, his voice breaking completely. "When he was falling, he could have landed anywhere, but he twisted his body to fall near me instead of near them. Even dying, he chose to stay with the foolish old man who never deserved such devotion." "Doctor, Sarah Moon Walker arrived with the second wave of searchers, her veterinary bag seeming pitifully inadequate against Shadow's injuries. Her examination confirmed what everyone could see: massive internal trauma, spinal damage, injuries that would have killed a smaller animal instantly. That Shadow had survived even this long was testament to his incredible will to live and his determination to remain with Benjamin until the end. "There's nothing I can do," Sarah admitted, her professional composure cracking as she looked into Shadow's amber eyes, still alert despite his mortal wounds. "He's suffering, Benjamin. The kindest thing would be to let him go peacefully." Benjamin's howl of anguish echoed off the canyon walls, a sound so raw and primal that it seemed to answer the wild wolves still watching from above. 3 years of companionship, 3 years of healing from his grief over Margaret's death, 3 years of believing he'd found family again, all of it ending in this remote wilderness with the creature he'd loved more than life itself dying in his arms. The wild wolves on the ridge began their own mournful chorus, their voices joining Benjamin's grief in a harmony that transcended species. They understood loss, understood the bonds that connected pack members, understood that something precious was slipping away from the world. Joseph Running Bear found himself unprepared for the emotional impact of watching this elderly man's heart break in real time. His own daughter's death had been abstract, clinical, investigators' reports and DNA analysis of fabric scraps. But this was immediate, visceral, the raw reality of love confronting mortality, without the buffer of time or distance. "I failed him," Benjamin whispered, cradling Shadow's massive head in his lap. "He trusted me to keep him safe, and I led him here to die. What kind of father does that make me?" Mary Singing Bird arrived with the third search group, her 78-year-old body pushed beyond reasonable limits by her determination to reach Benjamin in his darkest hour. She took one look at the scene: the dying wolf, the broken old man, the wild pack mourning from the ridge, and understood immediately that they were witnessing something that would change everyone present forever. "Benjamin Crow Feather," she said firmly, kneeling beside her oldest friend despite her arthritic knees. "That wolf lived 3 years of love because of you. 3 years of warmth, comfort, purpose, and family. How many creatures get that much happiness in a lifetime? How many humans, for that matter?" But Benjamin was beyond consolation. The dementia that had been threatening his cognitive function for months chose this moment to assert itself completely, triggered by trauma and exhaustion. He began speaking to Shadow as if the wolf could respond, recounting memories from their 3 years together, apologizing for every moment of pain, promising to join Margaret and Shadow soon so they could all be together again. The search team faced an impossible situation. Shadow was dying slowly and painfully, his injuries far beyond any hope of treatment. Benjamin was deteriorating rapidly, his grip on reality sliding away as he retreated into memories and fantasies that offered escape from unbearable present circumstances. The wild wolves continued their vigil from the canyon rim, their mournful songs creating a soundtrack for tragedy. Thomas White Eagle made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. As sheriff, he carried a sidearm capable of ending Shadow's suffering quickly and humanely. As Benjamin's friend, he understood that prolonging the wolf's agony served no purpose except to torture an old man who'd already endured more loss than anyone should bear. "Benjamin," Thomas said quietly, drawing his weapon, "let me help him find peace." The gunshot echoed through the canyon like thunder, followed by silence so profound it seemed to swallow sound itself. Shadow's amber eyes closed for the final time as his breathing stopped, his magnificent body finally free from pain. The wild wolves on the ridge howled once more, a farewell that seemed to carry their fallen family member's spirit toward whatever wilderness awaited beyond death. Benjamin's reaction was immediate and devastating. He collapsed across Shadow's still form, his aged body convulsing with sobs that came from depths of grief most humans never experience. The careful psychological balance he'd maintained since Margaret's death shattered completely, leaving him lost in a confusion of memories where Shadow was still alive, Margaret was still cooking breakfast, and the world still made sense. Joseph Running Bear watched the scene unfold with growing horror, recognizing parallels to his own daughter's death that made his chest tighten with empathy. The federal agent who'd arrived intending to enforce regulations found himself confronting the raw reality of love, loss, and the bonds that connected all living creatures in ways that transcended law and policy. As the rescue team prepared to evacuate Benjamin from the canyon, the wild wolves began to disappear one by one, melting back into the wilderness that had always been their true home. They left behind only memories of their brief encounter with human grief and the understanding that some losses echo across species boundaries, touching hearts that beat in rhythm with the ancient songs of survival, family, and inevitable mortality. The tragedy in the canyon would become legend in Broken Arrow, a story told and retold about the depth of love possible between human and animal, and the price both sometimes pay for daring to cross the boundaries that separate civilized life from the wild truth that lurks in every beating heart. The sound that pierced the canyon's silence wasn't Benjamin's grief-stricken wail or the echo of Thomas White Eagle's gunshot. It was a child's voice, high and clear, calling out from somewhere impossibly close, yet completely hidden from view. "Daddy! Daddy! I'm here! The wolves kept me safe!" Joseph Running Bear's world tilted on its axis as he recognized the voice that had haunted his dreams for 3 agonizing years. Emma Stone Crow, his 8-year-old daughter who'd been pronounced dead at Yellowstone National Park, emerged from a narrow crevice in the canyon wall, her dark hair longer now, her small body lean and strong from wilderness survival, but unmistakably alive. "Emma?" Joseph's voice cracked like a teenager's as he stumbled toward the impossible vision of his lost child. "Emma, is that really you?" The reunion was electric, primal, a father's desperate embrace of the daughter he'd mourned, buried in his heart and carried as guilt for 1,000 sleepless nights. Emma clung to Joseph with the fierce intensity of a child who'd learned that safety was temporary and love was precious beyond measure. "The wolves found me after I fell in the river," Emma explained through tears that matched her father's. "I was hurt and scared, but they brought me food and kept me warm. They taught me which plants were safe to eat, how to stay hidden from bears, how to survive. They're not monsters, Daddy. They're my family, too." Benjamin, lost in his dementia-fueled confusion, watched the reunion with dawning recognition that pierced through his psychological fog. "The pack," he whispered, his weathered hands still stroking Shadow's still form. "They weren't dangerous. They were protecting her. All this time, they were protecting a lost child." Dr. Sarah Moon Walker's veterinary training kicked in as she examined Emma, finding her remarkably healthy despite 3 years of wilderness living. "She's adapted," Sarah marveled, noting the calloused hands, the keen alertness, the way Emma instinctively positioned herself where she could monitor all potential threats. "The wolves didn't just keep her alive, they taught her to thrive." The revelation recontextualized everything. Joseph's 3-year crusade against wolves hadn't been protecting anyone. It had been threatening the very creatures who'd saved his daughter's life. His federal authority, his bureaucratic power, his unwavering determination to eliminate Shadow and his pack had all been directed against the guardians who'd done what human search parties couldn't accomplish. "Shadow knew," Benjamin said with sudden clarity, his dementia lifting momentarily as understanding flooded through him. "That's why he brought me here. He wasn't coming to join his pack. He was coming to bring Emma home." My boy died trying to reunite a father with his daughter. The wild wolves on the canyon rim began descending, no longer wary of the humans below. Emma called to them in a mixture of English and sounds that approximated wolf vocalizations, her communication with them natural and fluent after 3 years of shared survival. The massive alpha male, scarred from countless battles and winters, approached Emma with gentle reverence, allowing her to bury her face in his thick fur one final time. "This is Grayback," Emma said, introducing her father to the wolf who'd served as her protector and surrogate parent. "He found me first, pulled me from the river when I was drowning, and this is Moonsinger. She shared her milk with me when I was too weak to forage." The second wolf, clearly the pack's matriarch, touched Emma's hand with her nose in a gesture that transcended species boundaries. Joseph knelt beside his daughter and the wolves who'd raised her, his federal authority meaningless in the face of such profound gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered to creatures he'd been trained to see as dangerous predators. "Thank you for keeping her safe when I couldn't." The third revelation struck with devastating clarity as Benjamin's memories began returning in fragments triggered by stress and emotional overwhelm. "I remember now," he said, his voice gaining strength even as his body remained frail. "I wasn't just a veterinarian. I worked with the Federal Wildlife Program 20 years ago, before Emma was born. Shadow wasn't a random hybrid. He was part of an experimental program to create wolves capable of bridging human and wildlife communities." Dr. Sarah Moonwalker's eyes widened as she processed the implications. The socialization, the intelligence, the protective instincts. Shadow wasn't naturally occurring. He was specifically bred for human compatibility while retaining wolf characteristics. That's why his behavior was so remarkable. "The program was shut down," Benjamin continued, his memories flooding back like a broken dam. "Political pressure, funding cuts, fears about liability. The wolves were supposed to be relocated to sanctuaries, but Shadow disappeared during transport. I've been looking for him ever since, though I'd forgotten why until now." The final piece of the puzzle emerged as Emma described her 3 years with the pack. "Shadow visited us sometimes," she said. "The other wolves called him different names, but he was always gentle with me. He brought things from the human world, blankets, food, medicines. He was trying to help me survive until I could go home, but I was too scared. I thought everyone forgot about me." Joseph's radio crackled with updates from the search command post. The media circus surrounding Shadow's story had exploded into national headlines with news of Benjamin's disappearance. Federal wildlife officials, congressional representatives, and advocacy groups were all demanding answers, investigations, and policy changes based on the unprecedented situation in Broken Arrow. "Sir," the radio voice continued, "we've got senators calling for hearings on federal wildlife management, animal rights groups organizing protests in Washington, and 3 documentary crews en route to your location. This story has gone viral worldwide." But none of the external pressure mattered in the sacred space of the canyon, where a father had been reunited with his lost daughter through the sacrifice of a wolf who'd loved an old man enough to die bridging 2 worlds. The political implications would sort themselves out later. What mattered now was healing. Benjamin's grief over Shadow, Joseph's guilt over his misdirected crusade, Emma's need to rejoin human society, and the community's understanding of what they'd almost lost. Emma knelt beside Shadow's still form, her small hands gentle as she touched the wolf who'd served as messenger between species. "He was trying to tell you something important," she said to Benjamin. "The pack showed me how he would pace at the forest edge, looking toward town, wanting to bring me home but knowing humans wouldn't understand. He carried that burden for 3 years." The wild wolves began their departure as the sun reached its zenith, their mission complete now that Emma was reunited with her human family. They moved with the fluid grace of creatures returning to their natural element, leaving behind only tracks in the dust and memories of a love that transcended every boundary humans had created. Benjamin watched them go with tears streaming down his weathered cheeks, finally understanding Shadow's true purpose. "He wasn't my pet," Benjamin whispered. "He was never my pet. He was a guardian, a bridge, a teacher sent to show us that love doesn't recognize species boundaries, and I almost destroyed that gift because I couldn't see past my own loneliness." Joseph Running Bear faced a choice that would define the rest of his career and his relationship with his daughter. He could return to his federal position, enforcing regulations that separated human and wildlife communities. Or he could use his authority and Emma's story to advocate for new policies that honored the bonds between species while ensuring safety for all. "Emma," he said, looking into eyes that held 3 years of wilderness wisdom, "what do you want me to do? You've lived with both worlds, human and wolf. What would Shadow want us to learn from his sacrifice?" Emma's answer came without hesitation, carrying the clarity of a child who'd learned profound truths about survival, family, and love from teachers who spoke without words. He'd want us to remember that family isn't about being the same species. It's about choosing to protect each other. The wolves taught me that. Benjamin taught Shadow that, and Shadow died trying to teach all of us that. The canyon fell silent, except for the whisper of wind through pine branches and the distant sound of rescue helicopters approaching to bring them all home to a world that would never look quite the same again. 1 year later, Benjamin Crow Feather stood in his backyard watching the most remarkable sight he'd witnessed in his 73 years of life. Emma Stone Crow, now 9 and thriving after months of gentle reintegration into human society, sat cross-legged in the grass, teaching a group of Broken Arrow children how to read animal body language and understand the natural world around them. "See how that squirrel's tail is twitching?" Emma explained to 6 wide-eyed youngsters, her voice carrying the patient wisdom of someone who'd learned survival from the best teachers nature could provide. "He's not scared, he's curious. Shadow taught me the difference between fear signals and interest signals. Animals are always talking to us if we know how to listen." The Shadow Memorial Wildlife Education Center had been built on the site where Benjamin's cabin once stood, funded by donations that poured in from around the world after Emma's story captured international attention. The modest facility included classrooms, rehabilitation spaces for injured wildlife, and living quarters for Benjamin, who served as the center's director despite his advancing age and occasional memory lapses. Joseph Running Bear arrived for his weekly visit, his federal uniform replaced by the casual clothes of a man who'd found new purpose. After a congressional hearing that resulted in sweeping reforms to wildlife management policies, Joseph had taken early retirement to establish a program connecting military veterans with wildlife conservation work. His daughter's survival had taught him that healing came through protecting rather than destroying. "How's our star pupil doing today?" Joseph asked, settling beside Benjamin on the porch swing they'd installed to accommodate the old man's increasing need for rest and reflection. "She's remarkable," Benjamin replied, watching Emma demonstrate how to approach a nervous rabbit without triggering its flight response. "The other children learn more in an hour with her than most adults absorb in a lifetime. Shadow would be proud." The memorial statue stood at the center of the Education Center's garden, a life-sized bronze sculpture of Shadow in his characteristic protective stance, amber eyes alert and caring, one paw extended as if offering comfort to anyone who needed it. The inscription read simply, "In memory of Shadow, who taught us that love recognizes no boundaries." Mary Singing Bird emerged from the center's kitchen carrying a tray of lemonade and cookies, her face glowing with the satisfaction of a woman whose faith in love had been vindicated. At 79, she served as the center's volunteer coordinator, organizing the steady stream of visitors who came to learn about the remarkable story of a wolf who'd bridged two worlds. "Benjamin, that reporter from National Geographic, is here for the follow-up interview," Mary announced. "She wants to know how the center has impacted the community." The transformation of Broken Arrow had been nothing short of miraculous. The small town that had once been divided over Shadow's fate had become a model for human-wildlife coexistence. Tourism revenue from the education center had revitalized the local economy. Young families were moving back to the area, drawn by the unique educational opportunities and the community's commitment to environmental stewardship. Dr. Sarah Moon Walker arrived for her daily veterinary rounds at the center's rehabilitation facility, where injured and orphaned wildlife received care before being returned to their natural habitats. Her research on human-animal bonds, inspired by Shadow's story, had revolutionized veterinary psychology and earned her recognition as a leading expert in interspecies communication. "We've got 3 new arrivals this week," Sarah reported to Benjamin. 2 wolf pups whose mother was killed by a vehicle, and a young black bear cub that got separated from its family. "Emma's been helping with their rehabilitation. She has an intuitive understanding of wild animal behavior that I've never seen in someone so young." The wolf pups, in particular, had responded to Emma with remarkable trust. She spoke to them in the mixture of human words and wolf vocalizations she'd learned during her 3 years in the wilderness, helping them overcome their fear of humans while preparing them for eventual release back to the wild. Thomas White Eagle stopped by during his afternoon patrol, his sheriff's duties now including regular checks on the center's security and coordination with federal wildlife officials. The controversial decision to allow Emma's wolf pack to remain in the area, under careful monitoring, had proven successful beyond anyone's expectations. "The pack's doing well," Thomas reported. "They've established territory in the protected corridor we designated, and there haven't been any conflicts with livestock or humans. It's like they understand the boundaries we've agreed on." As evening approached and the day's visitors departed, Benjamin found himself alone with Emma in the memorial garden. The young girl often stayed after her lessons, drawn to the statue of the wolf who'd connected her 2 families, the pack that had raised her and the father who'd never stopped looking for her. "Do you think Shadow knew what would happen?" Emma asked, her small hand resting on the bronze wolf's paw. "Do you think he knew that bringing me home would change everything?" Benjamin considered the question with the careful attention he now gave to all matters relating to Shadow's memory. "I think Shadow understood love in ways that most humans never learn," he said finally. "He knew that protecting someone you care about is worth any sacrifice, and he trusted that love would find a way to heal the hurt his sacrifice might cause." The sun set over the Montana mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Benjamin of the amber eyes that had watched over him during his darkest hours. The memorial garden filled with the sounds of evening, crickets chirping, wind rustling through leaves, and somewhere in the distance the contented sounds of the wolf pack that Emma still visited on weekends under careful supervision. "Thank you, Shadow," Benjamin whispered to the gathering darkness. "Thank you for teaching an old man that family comes in all forms, that love transcends every boundary we think matters, and that sometimes the greatest gift we can give is helping others find their way home." Emma slipped her small hand into Benjamin's weathered one, 2 survivors connected by their love for a remarkable wolf who'd taught them both that home wasn't a place. It was wherever hearts chose to heal together. In the distance, a wolf howled once, briefly, as if acknowledging the gratitude that drifted up from the memorial garden toward the stars that watched over all creatures who dared to love beyond the limits of their own species. Dear friends, after sharing Shadow's incredible journey with you, I want you to know that this story isn't just about a remarkable wolf. It's about the truth we all carry in our hearts as we navigate these precious years of our lives. Like Benjamin Crowfeather, many of us have faced the profound loneliness that comes after losing a spouse, after children move away, after retirement leaves us wondering if our best days are behind us. But Shadow's story reminds us that our greatest chapters might still be waiting to be written. At 72, Benjamin thought his purpose had ended with Margaret's passing. Instead, he discovered that love multiplies when we open our hearts to unexpected family, whether that's a rescued animal, a neighbor in need, or even strangers who become chosen family. Shadow showed us that it's never too late to make a difference, that wisdom earned through life's battles becomes our greatest gift to others, and that sometimes the very act of caring for someone else heals our own wounded hearts. Your experience, your kindness, your capacity to love, these aren't diminishing with age. They're deepening into something more precious than gold. What unexpected blessing has entered your life when you thought your story was ending? How has caring for others helped heal your own heart? Please share your stories below. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.